Ray Charles once said, "I was born with music inside me. But the day I took control of my music, that's the day I was truly born." Nobody understood what he meant. Not really. Not fully. They heard the words, and they nodded, and they moved on. But those words carried the weight of decades, the weight of contracts, and courtrooms, and quiet battles fought in rooms the public never saw. There are two versions of Ray Charles that history remembers. The first is the one everyone knows, the man at the piano, head swaying, voice pouring out like warm honey over a cold night. The genius, the legend, the icon, the man whose music crossed every boundary that America had spent centuries building. But there is a second Ray Charles, one who sat in boardrooms instead of concert halls, one who read contracts in Braille while lawyers assumed he couldn't read at all, one who smiled politely and said very little and understood absolutely everything. This is the Ray Charles that history forgot to mention. This is not a story about music. This is a story about power, about a blind man who saw everything the music industry tried to hide, about a man who was told, in 100 different ways, by 100 different people, that he should be grateful for what he had, and who decided, quietly, methodically, that grateful was not enough. To understand what Ray Charles did, you first have to understand the world he was born into. September 23, 1930, Greenville, Georgia, a small town in the American South, where the rules were clear and the rules were cruel. Ray Charles Robinson was born into poverty so deep it had its own particular silence, the silence of a family that knew better than to want too much. His father was largely absent. His mother, Aretha, a woman of extraordinary strength, raised him alone. They lived in a shack with no electricity, no running water, and very little of anything else. But there was music. There was always music, and from the very beginning, Ray Charles heard it differently than everyone around him. At the age of 4, he watched his younger brother George drown in a washtub of water. He was there. He saw it happen, and he could do nothing. That image never left him. It settled somewhere deep inside him, and it became part of everything he ever played. Shortly after, Ray Charles began losing his sight, glaucoma, moving slowly, taking first the edges of his vision, then the center, then everything. By the age of 7, he was completely blind. His mother, devastated but determined, refused to let him become helpless. She taught him to memorize, to navigate, to feel the world with his hands and his ears in ways that sighted people never learn. She sent him to the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind in St. Augustine, and it was there, in that institution, that Ray Charles discovered what he was. He learned to read music in Braille. He learned to play piano, clarinet, organ, saxophone. He absorbed everything the school offered, and then quietly began to exceed it. When his mother died in 1945, Ray Charles was 15 years old. He was blind, he was alone, and he was completely broke. Most people, facing those circumstances, would have disappeared. Ray Charles decided to become famous instead. He moved to Jacksonville, then Orlando, then Seattle, playing clubs, bars, any room that would have him. He was a teenager performing for adults in venues that were often rough, sometimes dangerous, and always underpaid. But he was learning something more valuable than money. He was learning how the music business worked, and more importantly, he was learning how it didn't work for people like him. In the early 1950s, Ray Charles was already extraordinary. He could hear a song once and play it back perfectly. He could arrange, compose, and perform simultaneously at a level most musicians spent their entire careers chasing. But none of that mattered to the music industry, because in the music industry, talent was a product, and products didn't own themselves. When Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records in 1952, he was 22 years old, virtually unknown, and completely broke. The contract he signed was standard for the era, which is to say, it was designed entirely in the label's favor. Atlantic owned the masters. Atlantic controlled distribution. Atlantic decided what got released, when, and how. Ray Charles got a small advance, a modest royalty rate, and the privilege of being told what to do. For years, he accepted this. Not because he didn't understand the terms. Ray Charles understood everything with razor-sharp precision. He accepted it because he had no choice. The music industry in the 1950s was not a meritocracy. It was a hierarchy, and at the bottom of that hierarchy sat black artists, regardless of how gifted they were. But something was shifting inside him. With every record that climbed the charts, with every sold-out venue, with every dollar that flowed into the label's accounts while he struggled to cover his own expenses, the quiet anger in Ray Charles grew louder, not the kind of anger that shouts, the kind that calculates. By 1954, Ray Charles had released his first major hit. By 1955, he was a recognizable name on the rhythm and blues circuit. By 1959, he was one of the most commercially successful artists in America. His records were selling millions of copies. Atlantic Records was profiting enormously, and Ray Charles owned nothing. Not a single master tape, not one piece of his own music, nothing. He was, in the most literal sense possible, a genius working for free, and he knew it. He had known it for years, but knowing something and being in a position to change it are two entirely different things. Ray Charles was waiting, patiently, precisely, for the right moment. The year was 1959. Ray Charles's contract with Atlantic Records was coming to an end, and for the first time in his career, he had something he'd never had before. Leverage. Real leverage. The kind that comes not from desperation, but from being wanted by more than one powerful party at the same time. ABC Paramount Records came to him with an offer, a significant advance, far more than Atlantic had ever paid, more creative freedom, better royalty terms. On paper, it looked like the obvious choice, but Ray Charles didn't make decisions based on what looked obvious. He made decisions based on what was true, and the truth was more complicated than any advance could cover. He sat with his manager, Joe Adams, and he thought carefully, not about the money, not about the advance, about something much more important, about what it would mean 10 years from now, 20 years from now, to own or not own the recordings he was about to make. He was thinking like an economist at a time when most artists were thinking like performers. He told his team that he didn't want just a record deal. He wanted something no black artist, and very few white artists, had ever demanded before. He wanted to own his masters. The room went quiet. His team exchanged glances. Even Joe Adams, a shrewd and experienced man, paused before responding. In 1959, asking a major label to let an artist own their master recordings was not just unusual, it was practically unheard of. The masters were the crown jewels of the record label's business model. They controlled what got re-released, what got licensed, what got turned into profit for decades to come. Giving up the masters meant giving up a perpetual revenue stream. No label did that willingly. No label did that at all. ABC Paramount said no. Firmly, professionally, no. Then Ray Charles said something that changed everything. He told them he would walk away. He would go back to Atlantic. He would sign with someone else entirely. He would, if necessary, take his talent and his audience and his name and disappear from their offer completely. And here is where the story gets extraordinary, because Ray Charles wasn't bluffing. He had done the math. He had studied the contracts. He had thought through every possible outcome. And he had concluded, with the cold analytical mind of someone who had spent years being underestimated, that he was worth more than any advance they could offer, that his future recordings were worth more than anything they were currently valuing them at. The negotiation lasted weeks. Behind closed doors, in offices Ray Charles would never see, executives argued about numbers and precedents and risks. They brought in lawyers, they ran projections, they debated what it would mean to set this kind of precedent, to let an artist, a black artist, walk away with ownership of his own work. After weeks of back and forth, ABC Paramount blinked. They agreed to give Ray Charles something almost unprecedented for a black artist in 1959, ownership of his master recordings after a set period of time. In exchange, they would handle distribution and promotion. Ray Charles would retain creative control, and eventually, the recordings themselves. It was a victory so quiet that most of the world never heard about it. But inside the music industry, it sent a tremor through every boardroom. With his new deal in place, Ray Charles didn't just make records, he built a company. In 1960, he formed his own management structure. In 1962, he founded Tangerine Records, his own label. and RPM International, his own music publishing firm. He was no longer just an artist. He was an executive, a businessman, an owner. Consider what this meant in context. The civil rights movement was still fighting for basic human rights for Black Americans. In large parts of the American South, Black people couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as white people, couldn't use the same restrooms, couldn't vote without facing violence, and Ray Charles was negotiating ownership deals with major corporations and running his own entertainment empire. He hired his own lawyers. He read every contract himself, in Braille. His team reported that he would often catch clauses that even experienced attorneys had missed. He had an almost supernatural ability to hold complex financial structures in his mind and identify exactly where the risk lay, where the language was vague, where the label had left itself a door to walk through later. Ray Charles did not trust easily. He trusted numbers, he trusted contracts, he trusted the logic of leverage, and he used all three to build something that outlasted every record label that ever tried to control him. Tangerine Records released albums by other artists. RPM International collected publishing royalties on his catalog. Ray Charles had transformed himself from a product into a proprietor. But this story is not purely about triumph, because Ray Charles paid a price for his independence that is rarely discussed. The music industry does not forget those who defy it. There were radio stations that quietly reduced his airplay. There were industry events where he was conspicuously absent from the guest list. There were business relationships that never materialized, not because of talent, but because of reputation. The reputation of a man who asked for too much. There were personal costs too. Ray Charles was a complicated man. His independence, his need for control, extended into his personal life in ways that damaged relationships, strained friendships, and left wounds that never fully healed. The same discipline that made him brilliant in a boardroom made him difficult in a living room. Genius rarely arrives without a shadow. And yet, he kept going. Not because it was easy, but because he understood something profound, that the moment an artist surrenders ownership of their work, they surrender a piece of themselves. That can never be fully recovered. He had seen what happened to the artists who came before him, who signed whatever was put in front of them, and spent the rest of their lives watching other people profit from their creativity. He had seen the blues musicians who died broke, while the songs they wrote played on radio stations across the country. He had seen the rhythm and blues pioneers who couldn't afford a lawyer, while the labels that owned their recordings built empires on their talent. Ray Charles had studied all of it, and he had decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been underestimated his entire life, that it would not happen to him. By the late 1960s, Ray Charles had achieved something almost unimaginable for an artist of his era. He owned his catalog, he controlled his publishing, he ran his own label, he negotiated his own deals. He was, in every meaningful sense of the word, free. Not just artistically, economically, structurally, free in the way that very few artists of any color, in any era, have ever managed to be. The music he made during this period reflects that freedom. Georgia on My Mind, Hit the Road Jack, I Can't Stop Loving You, Unchain My Heart. These were not songs made by a man under contract, producing content for a label's quarterly targets. These were songs made by a man who owned what he created and felt the difference in every note. Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004. He was 73 years old. He left behind 12 Grammy Awards, a catalog of music spanning 6 decades, and an estate valued at tens of millions of dollars, a significant portion of which came directly from the master recordings he had fought so hard in that quiet boardroom negotiation in 1959 to own. But the true measure of his legacy is not in dollars, it is in the artists who came after him. Every musician who has ever demanded ownership of their work, from Prince, who famously wrote Slave on his face during his battle with Warner Brothers, to Taylor Swift, who re-recorded her entire catalog to reclaim her music from a label that sold it without her consent. Every single one of them walked a path that Ray Charles helped clear. He did it quietly, without press conferences or public battles. He did it in boardrooms and contract negotiations, with lawyers and legal documents, armed with nothing but his mind and his absolute refusal to be owned. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't roar. It doesn't march. It sits across a table, reads the fine print, and says, calmly, firmly, without flinching. No. Ray Charles was born with music inside him, but the day he took control of that music, the day he picked up a pen and signed a contract on his own terms, that was the day the world truly began to understand what he was made of. The music was always his. It just took the world a little while to catch up.